Thank you for joining Envirochat, PerkinElmer's ongoing series of one-on-one conversations with leaders in environmental analysis. Episode 2. A macro view at microplastics in water. Microplastics are pervasive throughout the environment, which poses many questions. To answer some of these questions, we asked Professor Penny Lindick, the head of science for marine ecology and biodiversity at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the UK. Professor Lindick has over 20 years of experience studying eukaryotes, in particular zooplankton. The current focus of her work is on the impact of microplastics on the marine environment. Her research has been widely cited, and she has been called upon to give evidence on the issue of plastics pollution at the Houses of Parliament. And now, here is our host from PerkinElmer, John Martin.
Welcome, Professor Lindick. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Before we start talking about microplastics in depth, I was wondering what prompted you to take on this type of research, the plastics pollution, microplastics? Was there a specific event that interested you or prompted your interest?
I don't think there was a specific event as such, but as you said, my area of research for over 25 years now has been on zooplankton. So these are very small marine organisms that play a vital role in the health of our oceans. So therefore, when I first became aware of microplastics, probably about 15 years or so ago, it was a natural question to ask whether these small pernicious pollutants would cause a problem for the small marine animals, which are at the base of the food web. I think generally people were more aware of the problem that large plastic litter could cause to charismatic marine animals. So turtles mistaking carrier bags for their prey of jellyfish, or dolphins and seals being entangled in discarded or ghost fishing gear. But virtually nothing was known about the potential impact of these very small microplastics. And as I worked on small animals, it was just natural to then say, well, are the small plastics a problem to the small animals?
So microplastics, as you alluded to, everyone's familiar with maybe larger bits of plastic in the ocean, but microplastics by the very name are small bits of plastic. And on the face of it, it's maybe hard to comprehend the impact that they could have on the environment. Could you provide us with an idea of the magnitude of the issue and what kind of impact that they can have?
Certainly. So microplastics are indeed very small, but they vary enormously. We talk about microplastics, but there are a huge range of polymers that come in different shapes, sizes, colors, polymer types. However, they're ubiquitous. They're found all over our seas and oceans. They've been found from the tropics to the poles, from the sea surface down to the very deepest trenches, and in a wider range of matrices, including the surface water, the water column, the sediment, the biota, surfaces of hard substrates. A few years ago, conservative global estimates of floating microplastic debris have suggested that there's in the order of 5 to 50 trillion particles floating on the ocean surface. But research that we did last year and, published last year suggests that this could, in fact, be much higher, in the order of 12.5 to 125 trillion particles floating on the surface. So that doesn't even include what we find throughout the water column or what could be sequestered in the sediment. And owing to their very small size, it means they can be ingested by a wide range of marine life, from zooplankton, shellfish, fish, seabirds, turtles, and marine animals. So in one study alone, they found that 7 species of turtles from 3 oceanic basins all contained microplastics. This just indicates exactly how wide a problem that these very small plastic pollutants are.
Now, your work, the organisms that you study, zooplankton, are also very small. But they can have a very outsized impact on the environment. Can you provide us with some details on how the threat to these tiny organisms can translate and ultimately impact other parts of the ecosystem?
Yeah, so zooplankton, they may be microscopic, but they're hugely abundant, and they support a wide range of wildlife, from commercially important fish or juvenile fish to whales. They also help regulate global atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. From our studies, we've shown that when zooplankton, in particular copepods, which are a very dominant group of zooplankton, are exposed to microplastic, they ingest these very tiny bits of plastic. And this leads to reduced feeding of their normal prey and a decline in energy reserves. So in turn, this means they have a lower reproductive output. They don't produce as many offspring, or the offspring that they produce aren't as viable. It also lowers their survival rate. Both of these have a direct relevance to the copepod overall population and communities. And as zooplankton help to underpin the marine food web, an impact on zooplankton impacts on the wider ecosystem and the services it provides, such as our fisheries. But another ecosystem service that may be impacted is carbon cycling. Microplastics that are ingested by copepods are also egested in their fecal pellets. And the fecal pellets of zooplankton play a vital role in moving carbon to greater depths in the ocean, where it can be locked away from the atmosphere for many years. If the fecal pellets contain bits of plastic, they can be more buoyant, or they break up more readily. Therefore, zooplankton eating microplastics can have an important impact on ecosystem processes such as carbon sequestration and carbon cycling.
Now, in addition to the harmful effects that the plastics themselves can have, studies have shown that chemical contaminants in the environment can adhere to microplastics, and when they're ingested, essentially hitch a ride, if you will, into organisms. So the threat is not just from the plastics themselves, but also potentially from these other chemicals that are found in the environment and adhere to their surfaces. Can you explain a little bit why those chemicals would be of a concern?
Yeah, indeed. Microplastics can act like a type of nuclei in the environment, where they attract different chemicals of concern, like persistent organic pollutants. These are of particular concern because while the microplastics themselves are unlikely to cross across the gut barrier and into the tissues of the animals, the chemicals which have adhered to the surface of the plastics can desorb when in an animal's gut and cross the gut lining. So this means that the chemicals can actually have a bigger impact on the organism itself and can also lead to biomagnification of the chemical. So that's whereby a fish may eat a few hundred zooplankton, therefore magnifying up the concentration of that chemical as it passes up through the trophic levels. But in addition to the chemicals which can adhere to the outside of the plastics, in addition, the plastics themselves are a complex mixture of polymer matrix and numerous additives. So of equal concern is the chemicals which are intrinsic to the plastic and which may leach out, either because they've been designed to leach out over time or because the plastics have become brittle and are generally fragmenting and allowing those chemicals to leach out. And the additive chemical profiles of microplastics have shown the presence of a number of different chemicals such as stabilizers, lubricants, fire retardants, monomer residues and byproducts. And some of these have the potential to act as endocrine disruptors, impacting on the health of the organisms and therefore the overall population and communities.
Now, we are literally surrounded by plastics every day of our lives, and there's a lot of beneficial uses. You and I are talking right now on devices that have a lot of plastic components in them. Have you encountered any difficulties in convincing people of the problems that plastics can represent?
No, I think is the short answer. I completely appreciate that plastics are extremely useful to society. as you said, in everything that we do, not least the sort of medical environment, education, health and safety. I think the problem, though, is that society has been slow to deal with plastics at their end of use. And often when designing a project, no consideration has been given to what will happen to it when we finish using it. So the problem is less the plastic, but the way we deal with it at its end of use. Certainly, there's too much single-use plastic. For something which is designed to be so robust and durable, using it only once and throwing it away doesn't really make sense. But if the plastic that we do use could be properly reused, recycled, or reduced, there would be far less of a problem. So actually convincing people that plastic shouldn't be in the marine environment has never really been a problem. The greater controversy or the greater problem is how we deal with plastic when we've finished using it, how we stop it getting into the marine environment, and whose responsibility that is.
Now, you have been involved in some landmark work studying microplastics in the Arctic. Can you tell us a little bit more about those efforts and why they are so significant?
Yes, well, we first presumed that microplastics would probably have the biggest impact in coastal areas. These are areas that are biologically very productive. They're also close to the source of microplastics. So where we have a biologically active area and the microplastics is likely to be the greatest risk. Only more recently have we realized that microplastics are transported from countries like our own to the Arctic, where they can potentially accumulate. And I think it's really important to understand the impact of microplastics in this amazing and pristine environment, because unfortunately, it's already under many different stresses, and plastic is just another one. It seems such a shame that people thousands of miles away are actually impacting on what was a very pristine environment. And interestingly, we're already finding that the type of plastic which is ingested in zooplankton in the Arctic is a very different type of plastic to that which we find is being ingested by zooplankton closer to home in our coastal waters. So better understanding how that plastic is getting to the Arctic and what type of plastic it is absolutely essential to try and help maintain that really critical environment.
Yeah. Earlier in our discussion, you mentioned some rather large numbers of plastic particles being quantified in our oceans, and it's also been estimated that 4 to 8 million tons or more even of plastic enters the seas every year. Some people have done the math, and that equates to truckloads of plastics being dumped in the ocean every minute. The scale of this problem, when I think about it, seems to be very daunting. Do you ever get discouraged? How do you keep motivated to try to solve this problem?
It would be unfair to say I don't get discouraged. Sometimes I think I do. And I think sometimes when you see pictures which are really alarming, maybe pictures of rivers which look like they're just flowing with plastic as a source or as a pathway rather to the marine environment. But I think what does keep me motivated is that it's not too late to do something about it. And also I feel our ducks are actually all lined up, because everybody from scientists to environmentalists, the general public to industry, nobody really wants to see plastic in the wrong place. It's a commodity. It's not where it should be. So I'm motivated because I believe working together, we can hopefully create a more circular economy, an economy where it isn't a single pipeline, where we use something once and it ends up in the wrong place, but that we use this commodity to the best of its value, reduce, reuse, recycle it. But this will need to involve everyone. And I think we all have to be part of this circular economy and new way of thinking of how we use plastic. That includes us as consumers and also the producers.
Do you have, following up on that, do you have some practical suggestions that we as consumers, things that we could do in our daily lives to improve the situation or influence the development of some of these larger solutions?
I certainly think that we all have a part to play. And I don't think it's something that we as consumers can do on our own. I think the plastics industry needs to take responsibility for producing plastic that fits within a circular economy. Plastics that can be easily recycled, for example. I think our governments need to implement evidence-based policies to reduce plastic wastes, such as bottle deposit schemes. It's also not just a one-country problem. Plastic has no boundaries. It can be transported all over the world by currents. So thinking on a larger scale and having some joined-up policies would also really help. But as a consumer, I think we need to vote with our feet. We need to be aware of what we're buying. Do we need face creams full of microplastic particles? Do we need bananas that are wrapped in plastic? Can we avoid buying fast fashion items of clothing and look towards longer lasting non-synthetic clothing? It can be a little bit harder. Maybe we should be shopping more locally. We should be using greengrocers where we can just pick up our fruit and vegetable and put it in our basket and not have everything wrapped in plastic trays. And I think a certain amount of inconvenience on our behalf is a very small price to pay to protect and make sure our marine environment is clean and healthy and sustainable for future generations.
Looking ahead to your own research, can you share with us maybe a little bit about what you're going to be undertaking in the near term, and then longer term? What would you consider to be the successful outcome of your work?
Certainly, perhaps answering that in a back to front way, I think something that we're missing, which is really important, but seems very simple, is we need to understand the contribution of different sources of microplastic pollution to the marine environment. What are the main sources? What is their route of transport? Is this fibers from washing machines? Is it fragmentation of discarded fishing gear? Windblown dust from tire wear? We still don't really know the very basics of what constitutes marine microplastics. Absolutely, where are they coming from? How are they getting there? If we can better understand this, we can target looking at the risk that they pose. For example, are some plastics, maybe like tire wear, leaching into our rivers? But because they're heavy, maybe they're sinking out. Maybe they're causing a problem to the animals that live on the riverbeds. Are some of the more buoyant plastics, like fibers from washing machine, perhaps they're going much further afield and they're impacting things on zooplankton, which are oceanic organisms. And if we can understand this, we can target looking at the risk that microplastic poses, and we can better inform mitigation strategies and new policies. So then answering where is some of my research going? Well, it is to look at these different forms of microplastics. So in particular, tire wear and tire road wear particles. Some estimates have suggested this could be a really big contributor, and yet actually we're not often finding it in our environmental samples. And I think that's because we're not using the right technology and we're not looking in the right places. So we need to know how some of these potentially really big contributors are getting into the marine environment, where they're going and what risk they're causing. I'm also keen to look at potential alternatives, bioplastics, biodegradable polymers. These are all things which can be branded around quite easily. And as a consumer, it can be really confusing. Are they actually better? what does biodegradable mean? Is it just biodegradable in an industrial composter? In which case, that doesn't really make any difference if we're putting it in our home compost or it's still leaching out of that supply chain into the marine environment. So we're looking at potential alternatives and making sure that we don't start using something which is equally as bad as the more traditional plastics, or potentially even worse. Just making sure that we know what the risk is and helping the consumers to make a decision.
Well, certainly some very interesting work plan there, and I look forward to seeing the results of that. Thank you, Professor Lindick, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us today. It's been my pleasure to speak with you. And to learn more about Professor Lindick and her work, as well as the work of her colleagues at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory, please visit their website at www.pml.ac.uk. And thank you for joining us as well. We look forward to seeing you again on another edition of Environmental Chat.